The Scream by Kent Monkman, a presentation done by Jack Marble. The Scream by Kent Monkman was made to show horrors of the forced assimilation that Indigenous people had to face, specifically in this piece, the trauma induced by the Canadian residential school system. In the painting, we can see children being forcibly taken from their homes and mothers trying to protect the children from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the RCMP, as well as priests and nuns. In the back of the painting, we can observe noticeably older children running away from the RCMP priests and nuns, presumably escaping them. Another important piece of this painting is the animals. There is a dog who is very obviously agitated, and even the birds seem to be in a chaotic state. Overall, this image seems to induce anxiety, heartbreak, and complete pandemonium. You may recognize the name of this painting, The Scream, and that's because Kent Monkman used the same name as Edvard Munch's 1893 painting, and for good reason. Munch's painting shows personal anguish and grief, while Monkman seeks to show the overall suffering of the Indigenous people during this time period of Canadian history. By borrowing the title, Monkman invites viewers to make a comparison between the two works. While Munch focused on the emotional pain of one individual, Monkman expands that idea to represent the trauma experienced by entire Indigenous communities. Monkman is a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation in Manitoba, Canada, and was born in 1965. With this in mind, we know that Monkman grew up seeing the grip that colonialism had on the older generations and the effects that still last today. Those experiences help explain why so much of his artwork focuses on correcting historical narratives and giving Indigenous people the opportunity to tell their own stories. Monkman created this piece in 2017 as a part of his series called Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience. Monkman's main reason for making this piece was to show a piece of Canadian history not from the perspective of the government and/or colonizers, but from an actual Indigenous person. In doing so, he helped to show how the colonizers truly treated Indigenous people and encouraged viewers to think twice when assessing the truth of history. Rather than presenting a version of history that ignores Indigenous voices, Monkman challenges audiences to confront the realities of colonialism and recognize the long-lasting impact those events continue to have today. The main function of The Scream is to educate the viewers about a part of Canadian history that was often misrepresented by either the government or the settlers. Monkman shows impactful imagery, such as children being taken from their mothers, in an effort for us to empathize with Indigenous people and to recognize the lasting effects that colonialism truly has. Monkman does this through this piece with visual storytelling. Instead of simply presenting historical facts, he allows viewers to witness the emotions of the people involved in these scenarios, making the painting feel much more personal and memorable because it focuses on the human experience rather than just the event itself. One of the biggest aspects of this piece may be the absolute chaos and sense of urgency and stress there is. Other than the obvious factors such as children being taken and the animals being rowdy, the overall landscape is dark and somewhat ominous, feeding into the emotional impact that this painting has. The figures throughout the painting appear to all be moving at once, and there is very little in this painting that feels calm or still. As we mentioned before, the parents are reaching out towards their children, the children appear frightened, and the scene overall just feels completely out of control. All of these details work together to communicate fear, confusion, and desperation. Monkman made this piece by oil painting, and with his use of lighting, we as the viewer are drawn to certain factors within the painting, such as the brightly colored RCMP. The brighter uniforms immediately attract attention, making it clear who is carrying out the forced removal of these children. At the same time, the darker colors are used throughout much of the landscape to create a heavy atmosphere that matches the sadness of the scene. Monkman's realistic style also makes the painting feel believable, allowing viewers to imagine that they are witnessing an actual historical event instead of simply just looking at art. A major factor of this piece is the immediate emotional response it gives you. Whether or not you knew what the piece was about on first look, you'd be able to pick up on the sense of stress and fear and the overall panic that this scene sets. I think that this is one of the greatest strengths of the painting, actually, because before reading or learning the title of the historical context, viewers can already recognize that something tragic is happening by the expressions on the faces, the body language of the families, or just the overall movement and chaos that this painting has. The format of the painting also has a significant impact on the viewer. Unlike reading about residential schools in a textbook, a painting allows people to experience the event visually and emotionally at the same time. It encourages viewers to slow down, notice details, and really look at what they are seeing. Each time someone looks at the painting, they might notice something different, whether it's a facial expression, the lighting, or one of the figures in the background they missed the first time around. Because of this, the Scream succeeds not only as a historical work of art, but also as a powerful form of storytelling that educates its audience while leaving a lasting emotional impression. The first and strongest theme that is evident in the Scream is colonialism. We can obviously tell that these children are being forcibly taken, but there is so much more to this painting that we can't plainly observe. The act of taking the children was the first step of colonizing indigenous peoples, but as time continued, indigenous children were stripped of their native clothes, language, and through this cruel treatment, their identities as well. This painting reminds us that colonialism wasn't just about taking land. It was about also trying to erase an entire culture. Looking at the fear and the panic on the faces of the families helps us understand that these weren't just government policies on paper. They affected real people and had consequences that are still felt today. The next theme I'd like to talk about is resistance. Resistance is evident in this painting because Kent Monkman decided to paint it in the first place. The survivors of these residential schools are honored through this painting after being misrepresented by the government and settlers for so long. By making this painting, Kent Monkman worked to show everyone this piece of Canadian history through the eyes of an Indigenous person. Instead of allowing other people to tell this story, he reclaims it through his own artwork. It doesn't just tell us that something terrible happened, it challenges us to question the version of history that many people grew up learning. We talked a bit about identity in the last slide and how colonialism essentially stripped Indigenous people of theirs. Residential schools were designed to separate children from their families and communities while forcing them to abandon their own languages, traditions, and ways of life. The goal was to replace their Indigenous identity with a European one. Even though the painting shows that painful reality, I also think it helps reclaim Indigenous identity. By telling this story through Indigenous eyes instead of the perspective of the colonizers or government, Monkman reminds us that Indigenous cultures and identities were never completely erased. They continue to exist today, and Indigenous artists are able to tell their own stories on their own terms. Another theme that I think fits this painting is survivance. Throughout this course, we've learned that survivance is more than just simply surviving. It's about continuing to live, create, and preserve culture despite everything Indigenous communities have faced. Even though the Scream shows one of the darkest parts of Canadian history, the painting itself is proof of survivance. Monkman is preserving these stories through art and making sure they are continued to be seen and remembered. Instead of allowing these experiences to be forgotten, he's making them an ongoing conversation. I would say this painting also changed the way I kind of think about these course themes. Before taking this class, I probably would have thought about colonialism as something that happened a long time ago. This painting, The Scream, helped me realize that colonialism affected real families and that its effects don't simply disappear when residential schools close. Seeing those emotions on the canvas really made me feel the history much more than simply reading about it in a textbook. Overall, I think The Scream does an incredible job of connecting all these themes together. It shows us the effects of colonialism, it honors the residential school survivors, and it highlights the importance of cultural identity. More than anything, I would say it challenged me to think about Canadian history, especially this specific event, from an Indigenous perspective instead of the only version that has been traditionally taught.